Hello once again everyone, and welcome back to the Codex Wallerstein series. This is our second episode, and once again I'm joined by Ryan. And today, last week we went over the initial two plays, which are relatively straightforward. They're length and measure, so those had to deal with, of course, if I was further away, or if I was coming to move in, and as well as introducing us to the position of the scales. Today, we're going to be tackling the next two, which are called weak and strong. Now, as we talked about before, what these are, these initial couple plays, are really, it's teaching you a concept as well as an example. So they're really, really nice to go over, especially if, as a teacher, you're trying to explain a certain, part of it. Weak, in this case, has to deal with the feeling that he's giving me, and strong has to deal with the feeling he's giving me. The ones that will come later, before, after, and in the moment, are all great examples that you can very easily teach a student a relatively difficult to grasp concept very quickly. But to start off with, let's go ahead and go over weak. So what's going to happen here is, once again, we're going to be coming into the scale. So we've cut at each other, we've made ourselves small with the body, large with the sword, and this time the text says that if you find him hard, wind up like we did before. So that would be either the short edge or stepping up with this guy. And a question that I had, speaking of which, would be, when it comes to stepping up on the odd side, do you remain with your left foot forward? I don't believe so. I do believe that you wind up, but following it, most likely, you're going to end up having to take another step forward, and that's okay, because you have him wound up to the side. So what that might end up looking like, and what we'll see again when we do strong, is going to be, I'm here, I feel he's meeting me in the middle. As I go to wind up, he kind of tries to back off. I may end up having to take another couple steps forward, but that's all right. I've got him locked out. It's very easy for me to keep springing forward. However, if you can hit him in that initial, that's great, grand, and wonderful. Anyway, though, so once again, we're going to find ourselves in the scales, but it says if he is not hard, which he isn't, we're going to instead be suppressing his blade. Now, there's a couple different ways you can look at this. It doesn't describe which edge to use to suppress his blade, but the images seem to indicate that he is turning the sword over and suppressing with the short edge. So what I'm doing is I'm here, and I'm just pushing my pommel out and almost doing a crumph-like motion. And that leads, I think, to a lot of people thinking that this is a crumph, or even doing a crumph on reflex. Because as we know, if I come out into a bind here, if I just stick my thumb up and push with the long edge, I achieve pretty much the same thing. However, the pictures from both periods of the text's interpretation seem to indicate no thumb on the blade, and it is with the short edge, so I'm going with the short edge on this. It is quite powerful, and it's also quite sneaky. And another thing to consider is that when you have sharp edges, when you meet in the middle like this, if I push with the crumph, I have to go over his flat and then I kind of stick against him. This way, since I'm going over with my flat initially, when I stick, I can push him a lot further down. At least I find it that way, and it also feels a little bit stronger, which is quite nice. But anyway, following this, we got to talk about the footwork. So I've pushed him down, and life is great, grand, wonderful. Most times when we do the crumph suppression, we step out with our right foot, as we would when we normally do a crumph paddle. This, however, the image shows the left foot being forward both times. I personally am interpreting this as a cross step. So what that would look like is, right now we're on a line, we come down into the scales, I find him not particularly strong, I'm going to step out away from his sword while I suppress. That way I'm getting some distance away from him. If I step straight forward, there's a high probability of him just, dropping down and sticking that into me. So I do believe this is a cross step. It also lends itself very well to the follow-up motion, which is going to be snapping to his head. So we come down, we're here, I'm going to step out and suppress. Now at this point, I'm going to step around in a big circle with my right foot as I stick my thumb now onto the blade, but you don't actually have to. I just prefer to do it out of reflex. But I'm going to step forward around him as I pull on the pommel, raise up, step back with my left foot, and snap to the top of the head. And even though I am kind of sticking my thumb on the blade, most times this cut ends up as just a normal short edge cut coming down into ox. This is the schnappen, snapping, and is a big favorite of anyone who likes to play from the Crumpfau or gets pushed low a lot. But let's see that a little bit more in completion. So we're here, I find him weak, suppress, snap. Overall, not too complicated. And that's why I like doing this cross step, is because when I suppress, right, I get slightly off the line. This kind of coils me up both with my hands and with my legs. So when I step off it, I can really slow down to the side and get some good distance away from him. And I found that even if they manage to try and cover themselves, you can get enough distance to go right over it. So I find this particularly nice in combination with that cross step. And if he should choose to do anything like slip his blade out and come back at me, even though I'm crossed up, it's very easy for me to just fold back out into flug, or I can step back, or things of that nature. So it's not locking you into position. But that suppression and that following of him is what's really important here, because most likely he's not going to just stand there and go, oh no, right? He's going to probably try to run away as soon as you start suppressing his blade. A good analogy for this would be if you watch any grappling actions, when someone is reaching for a sword or even has their hand on the sword arm, the person will try to pull it back to get it free. Same kind of thing is happening here. The swords are just in place of our hands. But I'm going to throw my mask on, and we're going to show this a couple times. And this time I'm going to make sure to show it from both sides, as I forgot to do that last time. So, now we'll show it from the other side just for sake of ease. And one more time. So overall, not terribly complicated play and pretty easy to use, but what I really like about it is what it embodies. So the idea of weak. You could think of weak as being, the initial suppression. I think weak also kind of transcends that and also talks about his character. Not that I'm judging you, Ryan, you know I like you, but he has not come into this bind with a ton of presence, and if he's allowing me to push his sword down, his best response is going to be to try and flee, usually. Hopefully trying to pull his guard up or something along those lines. He remains very firmly on the back foot, and thus his position will kind of always be weak, versus I'm using two very strong actions without burning a ton of energy. So I personally look at it that way. If I were to call this a sermon, that would kind of be the message of it, right? But anyway, the next one we're going to go over is strong, the inverse of weak. Now, what's fun about this one is that it's very similar to the wind that we did in the first episode. And in fact, I mentioned in that one when I missed and went over his shoulder, not the end of the world, right? So this says, if we come down into the middle, and this time he's meeting me more strongly, it says if he is hard, you should wind, but if he is strong, I should go for this. Now what does that mean? Personally, I believe that to mean hard is where he's fighting me for the middle, right? In which case my best bet is to wind. Strong is when, as I'm going for that wind, or as I'm trying to go for that wind, he's continuing to put hard pressure against the middle of my sword. He's not adjusting to try and hit my tip, right? We talked about that before and how that leads into me doing things on the other side. And normally in most binding situations, they define someone being hard in the bind as being pushing you offline, and thus you need to cut around. I think in this instance, it's indicating he's pushing me in the middle, given our response. So, we come in and he's hard in the bind. I start to wind up and he continues to push me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spring out, raise my arms to put my strong against his weak as much as I can, and I'm going to put my sword over his shoulder. Now, parts of this is intentionally aiming, but honestly, if you're going for a wind and just shoot your arms up, most times I find you overcorrect because, of course, his sword is a lever. So if I push on it here, it's going to stay relatively here. I push on it up here, it turns like that, and so my point that was here will end up shooting over to this side anyway. So really, as long as you shoot your arms up like this, you'll end up over their neck anyway. So in case you're wondering why wouldn't you just stab him, that's I think what's being communicated here. I can't quite stab him, so I'm going to overcommit, and at the very least, I'm going to end up on this side of his head. Now, the text says to then lay the short edge upon his neck, and from here we can throw him to the ground. This is a pretty common throw. We see it done a bunch of times throughout the German tradition, but what's interesting about Wallerstein is it seems to kind of have a crumpling effect as opposed to a sort of backwards collar throw type look. So what's going to happen is we're here, he's hard, I'm going to really overcommit, and I get that hard pressure. I'm left foot forward, which gives me a lot more advantage than I normally have. I'm going to push forward on my pommel as I pull with my right hand. And my goal is to get the tip of my sword. I want to kind of stab it right into the ground where he is, so right behind him. So I'm kind of going over him. This is basically the same as me physically holding his shoulders and rolling them backward. At the same time as I push in like this, I'm going to bring my right foot up, not necessarily between his legs, but I am going to step very bodily close to him, so I can just crush him straight down, and I just push. Now sometimes you'll lock their sword with your crossguard, and that's great, grand, and wonderful, but even if it slips out, by that time he's already falling over. I'm not terribly worried about it. So let's show that from the other side. So we've come to bind. He's hard against me. I really wind hard and I put it over his head / onto his neck. I'm going to then step up and continue to push down. Sometimes he will fall. Other times I find people just kind of crumple away from you. And even if they're still standing, there's nothing he can do against you. That may happen as we do it at full speed here. We'll see what happens. It also depends upon the opponent. So sometimes you'll find people that it's not too difficult to knock them over. I outweigh Ryan, I believe, and I've certainly got the height advantage. Versus some of my bigger wrestlers, they'll usually remain standing. But either way, you lock him in a disadvantageous position, so I'm not terribly worried about what he might try to do against me. Also remember to keep that pressure going over his shoulder, because if you let that up and he gets his shoulders square, he can grab your legs. So now we'll show it a couple times. And then we'll show it from the other side, why not? And once more, go ahead and resist me on this one, like really resist. There we go. And so sometimes you may have to fight for it, but because I ended up on the far side of his head, even as he tried to stand back against me, that is not a particularly easy thing to resist. Just keep your force in and eventually he will crumple. But this is kind of the first of many techniques in Wallerstein that will show this kind of rush forward. Not necessarily, just going, hey, and charging, but more the idea of I'm giving him something he cannot choose to ignore. He's always having to do a response against it. And depending upon what response he gives me, I will just keep pushing forward. But either way, that's the weak and the strong plays. Next week we tackle Vor, Indes, and Nach, and those will be quite a lot of fun. But thank you very much, Ryan, for letting me abuse you. And we will go over the rest of those techniques as I get my glove off another time.